6 days, $40 million. 3 certified engineers, each with more letters after his name than Winthrop Aerodyne had years left on its lease, standing around a grounded jet like men waiting for a coffin to speak. Why would a rookie technician's unauthorized fix be the only thing standing between Winthrop Aerodyne and a grounded fleet? Nobody in that hangar could have told you, because nobody in that hangar had asked him a single question yet. The aircraft sat under work lights that made its fuselage look embalmed, a hydraulic actuator on the left main gear bleeding pressure it had no business bleeding, according to every gauge that mattered. Helena Kingsley stood beneath the wing in a charcoal suit built for boardrooms, not hangars, her heels finding the only 2 clean patches of concrete in the bay. She checked her watch. She checked it again 4 seconds later, as though time might have reconsidered. "Optics matter as much as outcomes," she said. To no one and everyone. The way she said it to any employee who slowed a schedule. This jet was supposed to fly out for the Ashford delegation 2 days ago. 2 days. Do you understand what that cost me in confidence alone? The man in the gray coverall did not answer her. He crouched by the gear well with a torque wrench in one hand and the thick, dog-eared maintenance manual open on the concrete beside him. A manual he had not so much as glanced at in the last 4 minutes. His name patch had gone soft and gray with years of solvent, the stitching barely legible. Malcolm Ferris. Nobody read it. Nobody in that hangar knew that the manual splayed open at his knee. 340 pages of torque tables, wiring schematics, and inspection intervals that every certified technician in the building treated as scripture, carried his name on its very first page too, buried under a change order stamp nobody had bothered to trace. "Follow the manual, rookie," Helena said, sharper now, loud enough to bounce off the steel rafters. "Page 118. Torque spec is right there. You are not paid to improvise on a $40 million aircraft." Malcolm set 2 fingers flat against the wrench arm and closed his eyes, the way a man might rest a hand on a chest to feel it still breathing. He held the pose exactly as long as it took the metal to answer him. Then he opened his eyes, ignored the manual entirely, and reached for a socket that did not match the printed spec at all. The 3 certified engineers exchanged a look that had contempt and relief braided together. Relief that someone else was about to be blamed. Camille Aldington, Winthrop's lead avionics engineer, arms crossed against her jacket, said nothing, but her jaw tightened the way it does when a person is rehearsing the sentence they intend to file in a report. Above them all, on the catwalk, a heavy-set man in a faded Winthrop cap named Garrett Boone had gone very still, watching the crouched figure below with the particular stillness of someone recognizing a voice he hasn't heard in years before he's even sure it's the same voice. Helena did not know that stillness meant anything. She only knew a jet 6 days late, a technician ignoring her, and a manual she trusted absolutely. Because it was thick, because it was official, because her name was on the letterhead above it. Stay with this one to the end. The manual comes back around in a way you won't expect. Long before any of that, in a kitchen 3 miles from the hangar, morning arrived the same way it always did, quietly, and on a schedule only 2 people in the house understood. Malcolm stood at the stove in sock feet. The flame beneath the saucepan turned low enough that the oatmeal barely trembled, stirring it the way he tested a bolt, patient, unhurried, listening for the moment it was ready rather than watching a clock. The kitchen held the smell of brown sugar and the particular quiet of a house where every object had already found its place and stayed there. A coffee mug with a chipped handle, a calendar with exactly 1 appointment written on it in a child's careful print, Science Fair, Friday. He walked down the short hallway and knocked twice on a door with a cloud sticker peeling at one corner. 2 knocks, never 3. He'd started it 4 years ago without deciding to, and it had simply become the shape their mornings took, the way a ritual settles into a house without either person naming it. "I'm up," came the voice on the other side, already dressed, already certain. Etta Ferris was 8 years old and moved through the world the way her father worked a wrench, without wasted motion. She came into the kitchen with her backpack already on one shoulder, hair combed into something close to neat, and climbed onto her stool at the counter to watch him spoon oatmeal into her bowl. She did not ask him how his day at the hangar had gone the night before. She had asked once, at 6, and learned that her father's silences were answers too, just slower ones. "You put the brown sugar in a spiral," she said, looking down at her bowl. "You always do that. Does it bother you?" No. She considered it further, the way she considered most things, turning it over once before setting it down. "I just noticed." He noticed things too. That was most of what he did, at the stove and at the hangar both. Noticed the width of a thing before he decided what it meant. He noticed now that she'd tied her left shoe twice and left the right one loose, the way she always did on days she planned to run at recess. He said nothing about it. Some things a father corrects. Some things he lets a daughter carry out the door on her own 2 feet. While she ate, he went to the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one that stuck a little in humid weather, and did not open it. He rarely needed to anymore. He knew what was inside without looking. A recipe card in handwriting rounder and looser than his own, stained faintly at one corner from a pot that had boiled over 11 years before Etta was born. One line at the bottom that Josie had written the way she wrote everything, plainly, as though the truth needed no decoration. Sometimes on a Sunday, when the house felt too quiet even for 2 people who preferred quiet, Etta opened that drawer herself and read the card without being asked, tracing the loops of a hand she was already forgetting the sound of. "Can I see it?" she asked this morning, spoon still in her bowl. He opened the drawer without a word and set the card in front of her, and she read it the way she always did, mouthing the words rather than saying them aloud, as if speaking them might use them up. Malcolm watched her from across the counter, hands loose at his sides, and did not tell her what he was thinking, which was that her mother's oatmeal had never once been made in a spiral, and that he had invented that habit himself, alone, in the first winter after the funeral, because a kitchen needed some ritual in it, or it stopped being a kitchen at all. 8 minutes, he said finally, nodding at the clock. She closed the drawer herself, gently, the way he'd taught her without teaching her, and slid off the stool already reaching for her shoes. 6 years before that morning, Malcolm Ferris had been Winthrop Aerodyne's lead systems engineer, the man whose signature sat at the front of every hydraulic and actuator manual the company printed, back when the company still printed his name at all. He had built those torque tables himself, tested them against failure data most engineers never bothered to chase past the point of passing certification, because he wanted the numbers to be true rather than merely sufficient. Then came the merger, a word that sounded bloodless in a press release, and felt, from the inside, like watching a room empty out around you while everyone else called it consolidation. His division was dissolved on a Tuesday. By the following printing of the manual, his name had been quietly scrubbed from the credit line, replaced by a department designation that belonged to no one and therefore offended no one. He hadn't fought it. There was a version of that year where he might have. Lawyers, appeals, the long grinding effort of proving a company had erased him, but Josie was already sick by then, the cardiomyopathy tightening its slow grip, and Etta was 4, and Malcolm had decided, in the particular way he decided most things, without announcing it to anyone, that a fight for credit was not a fight he could afford to spend himself on. He took a technician's job in the maintenance division instead, work far beneath what he'd built, because it kept him close to home, close to Josie in her last year, close to a small girl who would need someone steady long after her mother could no longer be the one standing still. He had told himself, at the time, that it didn't matter whose name was on the cover. The work would still be true even if nobody remembered who'd made it true. Now, 6 years later, he crouched beside a $40 million aircraft, while the CEO of the company that had erased him stood above him in heels, certain she was correcting a rookie. "I asked you a question," Helena said, her voice climbing the register she used for board meetings that were going badly. "Why are you deviating from a certified manual on my aircraft?" "Because the number's wrong," Malcolm said. It was the whole of his answer. He did not raise his voice to meet hers. He never had, not once in 6 years of being spoken to like this by men and women who'd never bothered to learn his name. Camille Aldington stepped forward from beside the wing, arms still crossed, the posture of someone building a case in real time. He's had this aircraft for 11 minutes, and he's already ignoring documented specification. With respect, Helena, this is exactly the kind of cowboy behavior that gets fleets grounded. It's not cowboy behavior, Malcolm said, still crouched, still unhurried. It's arithmetic. It's insubordination, Helena said, and if this jet isn't airworthy by end of day, it's also your job. She said it the way she said most things that mattered to her, flatly, as a fact rather than a threat, because in her experience, threats and facts had always amounted to the same outcome for people beneath her. She did not know she was firing, in effect, the man who had once decided the torque tolerances for half her fleet. She only knew a technician too stubborn to read a page. On the catwalk above, Garrett Boone gripped the rail and said nothing at all, watching the whole exchange with the stillness of a man doing long division in his head and not liking the number he was arriving at. The hangar noise thinned around Malcolm the way it always did once his hands found a problem worth solving. The compressor hum, the murmuring engineers, even Helena's voice, all of it receding to the edges of his attention while the actual work moved to the center. He set the torque wrench against the actuator fitting and did not consult the manual again. He didn't need to. He had memorized these tables the year he wrote them, the numbers laid into some part of his memory that outlasted the printing that replaced his name with a department code. 2 fingers flat against the wrench arm, eyes closed. He waited for the resistance to tell him what the gauge could not. A torque that felt fractionally looser than it should. A give in the metal that read, to anyone trusting the printed spec, as within tolerance. It was not within tolerance. It was off by an amount too small for a dial to flag and too precise to be an accident. Printing errors drifted randomly. A misplaced decimal, a transposed digit. This was consistent. This was a number that had been chosen. He's not even looking at page 118, one of the certified engineers muttered to another, loud enough to be a performance for Helena's benefit. Malcolm ignored him the way he ignored most performances. He worked the fitting a quarter turn tighter than the manual specified, listening to the actuator the way another man might listen to breathing in a dark room, waiting for the small change in rhythm that told him whether the pressure was finally holding or merely pretending to. It wasn't holding yet. He backed off, adjusted again, patient in a way that made Helena's foot tap harder against the concrete. "We do not have all afternoon," she said. "No," Malcolm agreed without looking up. "You don't. The delegation flies in 9 days, not 6. You have time. You just don't like spending it watching someone work slower than you'd prefer." Camille's arms tightened across her chest at that, a flush rising along her jaw, though whether from anger or the first faint prick of doubt, even she couldn't have said. She had been hired 18 months after Malcolm's fall from the design side, and everything she knew about the man crouched at her feet she had learned from a personnel file that listed him as a maintenance technician, grade 2. No notable prior experience worth citing. She had no reason to imagine the file was a lie. Files were not supposed to lie. That was rather the point of them. Above, Garrett Boone leaned both forearms on the catwalk rail, watching the particular way Malcolm rested 2 fingers on the wrench. The same gesture Garrett had watched a younger Malcolm make 100 times in a design lab that no longer existed, back when Garrett was a floor supervisor, still learning the difference between an engineer who trusted instruments and one who trusted his own hands more. 19 years on that floor had taught Garrett to recognize a signature the way other men recognized a face. He had just watched one. He did not say anything yet. He only watched Helena's certainty and Malcolm's silence occupy the same 6 feet of concrete and understood, with the settling calm of a man who has been waiting a long time for a debt to come due, that one of those 2 people was about to be very wrong in front of a great many witnesses. Malcolm made the final adjustment at 11 minutes past the hour by the wall clock. Nobody but him seemed to be watching. Tightened the fitting to the value his hands had trusted from the start, and stepped back. The hydraulic gauge, which had wandered for 6 days like something lost, settled into a flat, unwavering line and held there. Nobody in the hangar spoke. The compressor hum filled the silence the way it always did when human voices ran out first. "It's holding," one of the certified engineers said, quietly, almost apologetically, as though the gauge had betrayed him personally. Helena stepped forward, past Camille, past the engineers, and looked at the reading herself, checking it twice the way she'd checked her watch, unwilling to believe an instrument before she'd confirmed it with her own eyes. It held both times. "You violated a certified specification," she said, and there was something almost relieved in the accusation, a woman grabbing for the one fact that still made sense to her. "I don't care that it's holding right now. That number in the manual is the only number that protects this company legally, and you overrode it without authorization. That's grounds for termination, and you know it." "I know it," Malcolm said. He did not defend himself. He never did. He simply straightened, wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket, and looked at her the way he looked at a gauge that wasn't telling the whole truth. Not with anger, just with the patient attention of a man waiting for the rest of the information to arrive. It was Garrett Boone who brought it. He came down the catwalk stairs faster than a man his age and weight should have managed, crossed the hangar floor, and picked up the manual from where it lay open on the concrete, flipping backward through it with the practiced speed of someone who had once filed every page of it himself, working alongside the man who wrote it. "Helena," Garrett's voice cut through the hangar plainly, without heat. "Before you fire him, you might want to look at page 1. He held the manual open, angled toward her, toward the assembled engineers, toward Camille, toward the small crowd that had gathered without anyone quite noticing it gathering. On the manual's very first page, beneath a change order stamp dated years after the fact, sat a small engineering signature that had somehow survived every reprinting meant to erase it, tucked into a footnote nobody had thought worth scrubbing because nobody at the company anymore knew to look for it. "M. Ferris," Garrett read aloud, evenly, letting each word land on its own. "Lead systems engineer." The hangar went silent in a way it hadn't managed even during the 6 days the jet sat broken. Helena's eyes moved from the page to Malcolm and back again, slower this time, as if recalculating a sum she'd been certain of a moment ago. She was looking at him now the way she had not looked at him once in 6 minutes of shouting. Not at a coverall, not at a name patch gone soft with solvent, but at the actual man standing in front of her. And for the first time since she'd walked into that hangar, she did not know what to say. The silence didn't last. Vindication rarely does, in a room full of lawyers and liability. Within the hour, Winthrop's compliance officer had pulled the certified manual's current printing against the torque value Malcolm had just used, and the numbers told a story more complicated than anyone standing in that hangar wanted to hear. The value Malcolm trusted, the one that had made the actuator hold, technically violated the language of the FAA certified specification currently on file. Being right by feel did not make him right by paper, and paper was the only thing an aviation regulator had ever agreed to read. "So either he's a hero," Camille said quietly, staring at the discrepancy report now spread across a break room table, "or he just handed the FAA a reason to ground the whole fleet before the recertification vote even happens." Nobody in the room disagreed with her. That was the trouble. The discrepancy report, once it existed, could not be made to stop existing, and it surfaced a second fact nobody had gone looking for. The current torque specification hadn't simply drifted or been miscopied across editions. It had been formally revised 14 months earlier under an internal change order, Winthrop's own paperwork, filed and stamped and buried in an archive nobody consulted unless a lawyer demanded it. The line where an engineer of record should have signed off on the change sat blank. In its place was only a procurement approval stamp, dated, initialed, official-looking in the bloodless way official things always are, and utterly silent on who had actually decided the number should change, or why. "Someone revised a safety specification," Malcolm said, reading the report over Garrett's shoulder in the break room that evening, his voice as level as it had been in the hangar, "and didn't put their name on it. People don't usually hide a good decision," Garrett said. Helena, arriving late to that conversation, with her jacket still on, stood in the doorway a long moment before she spoke, her earlier certainty visibly gone from her the way color drains from a face. 11 days, she said. The fleet recertification vote is in 11 days. If the FAA finds out before we do that Winthrop's own manual doesn't match its own change orders, 3 institutional buyers pull their orders before we even get a chance to explain what happened. She looked at Malcolm now, without any of the sharpness from the hangar floor. I need to know if you did something reckless today, or if you just found something I don't want to have found. You already know which one it is, Malcolm said. You're just hoping I'll make it easier by lying. She didn't answer that. She left the break room instead, walking faster than her heels were built for, and nobody who watched her go could have said whether she was walking toward a solution or away from a question she wasn't ready to hear the rest of. Camille Aldington did not sleep well that night, and it had nothing to do with kindness toward a man she'd called a cowboy that afternoon. She simply could not accept that a technician with a thin personnel file had outdiagnosed her, and the fastest way to prove Malcolm Ferris wrong, she decided, was to find the paper trail that would show his memorized number was the fluke, and the printed manual was the truth after all. She spent the better part of 2 days in Winthrop's archive room, a windowless space that smelled of toner and old cardboard, working backward through revision logs the company had kept, out of habit rather than diligence, for 11 years. She found the 14-month-old change order easily enough. The same blank engineer of record line, the same procurement stamp, initials she didn't recognize pressed into the corner in blue ink gone slightly gray with age. LB. She noted it and moved on, chasing a different aircraft line entirely, one that had nothing to do with Malcolm's jet, hoping to find a clean revision history that would prove the 14-month-old change was an isolated correction rather than a pattern. Instead, 3 hours in, she found a second falsified torque specification, buried in the maintenance records of an entirely different actuator model, revised under a different change order number, but stamped with the same initials, the same procurement approval, the same conspicuous absence of any named engineer. She sat with that for a long moment before she picked up the phone. It's not one mistake, she told Malcolm, when he arrived at the archive room with Garrett a half hour later, still in his coverall, having come straight from the hangar. She turned her laptop toward him, the 2 revision logs open side by side, the initials glowing faintly on the screen. LB. Same stamp, different aircraft, 14 months apart. Somebody's been doing this on purpose. Garrett leaned in and read the initials twice before he said the name out loud, quietly, as though saying it too loudly might let the man hear it and run. Lawrence Beaumont, he said, VP of Procurement. Malcolm didn't look surprised, exactly. He looked the way he looked at a gauge that had finally confirmed what his hands already knew. Somebody swapped a part, he said, and needed the spec to match the swap instead of the truth. He turned the laptop slightly, tracing the dates with one finger, the same patient attention he gave a wrench. Cheaper actuator seals. You'd need the torque value changed to keep the failure signature from showing up on inspection. That's not an error, that's a cover. Camille sat back in her chair, the certainty she'd walked into the archive room with entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to the beginning of shame. I came in here to prove you wrong, she said, to Malcolm, plainly, the way a person admits a thing only once they've run out of better options. You found something truer instead, Malcolm said. That's not the same as being wrong. Nobody in that room was thinking about the recertification vote anymore. Not really, not as a business problem. They were thinking about how many aircraft in Winthrop's fleet were flying, right now, on a number someone had chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with keeping them in the air. The boardroom at Winthrop Aerodyne had windows on one side looking out over the tarmac, and on the day of the reckoning, every chair around the long table was filled, with 2 more brought in from the hallway for Garrett and Camille, and a folding chair near the door for Malcolm, who had not asked for a better one. An FAA compliance liaison sat at the far end with a legal pad and an expression that gave away nothing, which in Malcolm's experience was the correct expression for a man about to hear something he'd remember for years. Helena laid it out herself. Nobody had told her to, and several people in the room, including her own general counsel, had quietly suggested she let the discrepancy report speak without her narrating it. She did it anyway, standing rather than sitting, the folder open in front of her. 14 months ago, she said, this company issued a change order that altered a safety-critical torque specification with no named engineer of record. The approval came from procurement. She did not soften it. Lawrence Beaumont authorized a supplier substitution on actuator seals to a cheaper vendor, and then altered the corresponding manual specification to hide the change from anyone who might have caught it on inspection. He received a return commission from that vendor for 18 months before Camille Aldington found the second instance 3 days ago. She closed the folder. It was not an accident. It was concealment for money, and it very nearly cost us this fleet certification and, before that, very nearly cost a man his job for catching it. Beaumont was not in the room. He had been placed on administrative leave that morning, his access revoked before lunch. The matter handed to legal and, per the liaison's own notes, likely headed toward regulators rather than headlines. Nobody in the boardroom asked for more detail than that. Nobody wanted to savor it. Helena turned then to Malcolm, sitting in his folding chair near the door, coverall still faintly marked at the cuff, and said the thing she had clearly rehearsed and still could not make sound rehearsed. I yelled at you on my own hangar floor for deviating from a manual, she said, and I never once looked at whose name was actually on it. I had 6 years to find out who wrote the numbers this company's whole fleet depends on, and I never asked. That's not an oversight. That's the kind of thing that gets people hurt, and it very nearly did. She let that sit a moment. I'd like to offer you your title back, Lead Systems Engineer, full back pay from the 6 years since the merger, calculated at current scale. It won't undo it. It's what I can do. Every eye in that room turned to Malcolm, and he took a moment before he answered, the same unhurried moment he gave a wrench before deciding it had told him the truth. I don't want the title, he said. I never went to work on hangar floors because I was ashamed of it. I went because it kept me near my daughter when she needed me close, and I've come to like the work for its own sake, not for what it says on a door. He looked around the table, at Camille, at Garrett, at the liaison with his legal pad. What I want is smaller than a promotion, and it'll cost you less than what you just offered me. Every manual this company prints from now on, every torque table, every wiring schematic, I want the technician's name printed beside the work. Not a department code, not a stamp, a name, so the next person who reads it knows exactly who's answering for it, and exactly who to ask if the number ever looks wrong. Josie used to say a manual was only a promise someone else would check your work. He'd stopped believing anyone would. Helena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and wrote it down herself, in her own hand, at the bottom of the folder, as though she didn't trust anyone else in the room to get the wording exactly right. 3 months later, the recertification vote had long since passed, unanimously and without incident, and Winthrop Aerodyne's manuals came off the press with a new line under every technical revision, a name printed plainly beside the work it belonged to. Malcolm's sat at the front of 3 of them now, restored rather than erased, though he rarely mentioned it to anyone who didn't already know. He still wore the coveralls. Nobody had asked him to keep them, and several people, Helena included, had quietly assumed he wouldn't. He liked the work too much to trade it for an office, and most mornings found him on the hangar floor training a rotation of junior technicians. Camille Aldington among them now more often than not, standing at his shoulder, learning to rest 2 fingers flat against a wrench and wait for an answer instruments couldn't give. On a Sunday evening in early spring, the reissued manual sat open on the kitchen table at home, and Etta Ferris, 8 years old and unhurried the way her father was unhurried, traced the small printed line on its cover page with 1 finger. M. Ferris. The same slow, deliberate motion she used on the recipe card in the drawer by the refrigerator, the one with her mother's rounder, looser hand curling across a stained corner. It's the same, she said, not quite a question. Same idea, Malcolm said, watching her from across the table. Somebody made a promise, now there's a name on it, so people remember who to trust. She didn't ask him anything else. She never needed 5 questions when 1 would do, and this one she kept to herself, tracing the letters a second time before closing the cover, satisfied in the particular quiet way her mother used to be satisfied by things finally set right. If you believe the person doing the quiet work deserves to be seen before the crisis forces the question, you know exactly who this story was for.